welcome everyone. A warm welcome to all of our attendees and to our panelists. My name is Razan, and I am the head of content strategy and comms at Kawaakibi Foundation. Kawaakibi Foundation is a human rights organization which merges intellectual research with activism with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. The foundation was born out of the Arab Spring, co-founded by Iyad El-Baghdadi, who's joining us today as a panelist, and Ahmed Gatnash, our executive director. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview about Kawaakibi's values to rein in why we're hosting this event today. So at Kawaakibi, we envision and are hopefully working towards a world free of tyranny, in which society trumps a state where extremism in all its forms have no appeal, and where both individual and collective rights of groups and people are sacrosanct. So we try as much as possible to focus on the region from our perspective, and we try very much to ensure that the narratives of our people are sort of raised, and that we reject narratives forced upon us from those not from the region or those which stem from authoritarian regimes and settler colonial states. So today we'll be talking about prospects for human rights in the Middle East and North Africa in US foreign policy, and particularly in light of the US elections last week. Why are we centering US foreign policy in our conversation today? Because of its detrimental effect on some of the most urgent causes in the world at present, and the imbalance of power which gives the US an upper hand in Middle East and North African affairs, such as the genocide in Gaza, the Israeli aggression on Lebanon and Syria, the bankrolling of dictators in the region, and the continuation of a destructive status quo which goes primarily unchallenged. There's been a lot of conversations over the last year, and there's been a lot of frustration. It's difficult to sort of put a starting point to it. But if we say the Second Intifada in 2000, or since the war in Iraq in 2003, which intensified then in 2011 with the Arab Spring and the counter-revolutions by authoritarian regimes, which mostly reigned free, turning our movements and homes into decimated war zones. And then came the Abrahamic Accords and the normalization efforts led by Trump's administration between Israel and certain Gulf regimes, which led this frustration to finally implode last year when the onslaught and genocide on Gaza, and then the ground invasion and war in Lebanon by Israel started, all sanctioned, of course, by the United States of America. So we'll be touching on all of this today. We'll be speaking of the US policies and their implications on causes in the region from our perspective, and hopefully then having a conversation on how we should be moving forward as human rights defenders, policy influencers, and community organizers, and with intersectionality, given the inherent intersectionality between everything in our region, and how we interact with our respective causes. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel and get this event started. The event will be running for 60 minutes, so between an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. And we're hoping to have time for questions and answers at the end. So if you do have questions, please do write them in the chat or send them to the Kawaakibi Foundation chat if you don't want them to be public, and we will do our best to get to them. So joining us today, we have Iyad El-Baghdadi. Iyad is the chairman and co-founder of Kawaakibi Foundation. Iyad is a prominent Norwegian Palestinian intellectual and activist, and the co-author of the book The Middle East Crisis Factory. We also have Jasmine El-Gamal. Jasmine is a Middle East analyst and former Middle East policy advisor at the Pentagon. Jasmine advises organizations and individuals on policy, strategic communications, and workplace mental health. We then have Abdullah Alaoudh. Abdullah is a senior director for countering authoritarianism at the Middle East Democracy Center, and he previously served as a Saudi director at the Freedom Initiative. And before that, as a director for the Gulf at Dawn, a non-profit organization founded by now the late Jamal Khashoggi. And we have Karim Safieddin. Karim is a political writer and organizer from Lebanon and a PhD student in sociology. We welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. So Jasmine, will start the conversation with you. And I'm wondering if you can give us an overview of where we're at now regarding Biden's initial aims for policy in the Middle East and North Africa. Can we say that this is a full circle moment?
Well, thank you so much, Razan, for having me. And yeah, this is my first event actually with Kawaakibi Foundation, so I'm really happy to be here with all of you to talk about such important issues. And I love the focus that you mentioned on intersectionality and talking about these issues from a holistic perspective, because obviously the Middle East oftentimes is, kind of things are talked about, discussed in a vacuum when actually issues are much more related than not. So let me just start briefly by talking about the Biden administration. I just want to kind of quickly go back to the beginning of the Biden administration and even all the way back to the campaign when Biden was campaigning to be president, because there was such a marked difference between the focus of his campaign as it relates to the Middle East and then what actually ended up happening in the region. You'll remember that human rights was a focus of his campaign. I mean, he talked a lot about human rights in the region, and he, sort of vowed not to give a blank check or a free pass to autocrats, to people in the region who did not respect human rights. He had very harsh words for President Sisi of Egypt, Crown Prince MBS of Saudi Arabia. And he really gave the impression that this was going to be something that his administration cared about and prioritized when it came to the region. Now, once he became president, and I suppose that in an administration, I mean, I worked under the Obama administration as a civil servant, and you always kind of come up, there's a mix of reality and also will. And that, the combination of those two things will often dictate what an actual policy looks like versus policy promises during a campaign. And I think that when the Biden administration came into power, there are so many things, other things than the Middle East that President Biden wanted to focus on. And, one of those things was China. It was a real focus of his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. And so what ended up happening, as we understand it, is, the directive to his staff was sort of keep the Middle East off the president's desk. We have other things to focus on. And therefore, Middle East policy largely fell to his staff members, and particularly a couple of staff members in specifically who were focused on the Middle East, who had been working on the Middle East for a long time. So, namely Brett McGurk, for example, who many people who focus on the Middle East will know from his time working on Iraq and Syria and the war against ISIS and all that stuff. So he really became a very influential voice when it comes to Middle East policy. And the thing that he chose to focus on right off the bat was a continuation and an expansion of the Abraham Accords that started under President Trump, and trying to get that holy grail, as they saw it, which was Saudi-Israeli normalization. And those talks were quite advanced before October 7th. The talks were underway, and the Palestinian issue wasn't at the forefront of really any part of that policy. There was that infamous fist bump between President Biden and MBS in July 2022. And so, not even 2 years after he was promising to care about human rights. And so it was a very kind of swift shift to what they saw as pragmatic, economic focused initiatives that would hopefully have a trickle effect to stabilize the region and make the region more prosperous and integrate Israel into the region. Of course, I keep wanting to say September 11th. I'm sorry, October 7th changed all of that. And what we saw on October 7th was really just this complete shift in the importance of the Middle East on President Biden's desk. President Biden himself, as he has said before, is deeply, deeply committed to Israel's safety. He feels very personally connected to Israel. He has called himself a Zionist. And so his reaction was kind of twofold. One was a very personal reaction. He really felt that pain and that trauma that Israelis felt, and he felt very deeply empathetic with Israel at that time and since then. And then he also was looking at it as someone who, as an American, had gone through September 11th and understood what it was like to be attacked in your own homeland, and how the instinct is to go out and, sort of try to kill and destroy everyone who was responsible for that. So initially, his response to Israel was, on one hand, unconditional support, whatever you need, we're there. He also tried to warn them about making the same mistakes that the US made after 9/11, because as we all know, having worked on different issues in the Middle East, so many issues that we ended up facing, in the 5, 10 years past, were really either indirectly or directly stemmed from the US response to 9/11. And so President Biden was aware of those ripple effects. Some of them take years to materialize, and try to warn Israel not to go down that path. But what he was saying and what he was doing were sending two completely different messages to the Israelis. So he could have issued as many verbal warnings as he wanted to, but the fact is, when it came to supplying Israel with arms, to protecting Israel in the UN Security Council, that was kind of the ultimate message that the Israelis, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, was concerned about, not really anything that Biden was saying in whatever number of angry phone calls that they supposedly had, over the last year. And so what you saw was the Biden administration trying to do what we call a bear hug strategy, which is support Israel as much as you can publicly, so that behind the scenes it would give you some room to have tough conversations with them and get them to change their policies a little bit. Now, if you talk to the Biden administration and Biden administration officials, they will tell you that the situation would have been even worse without US pressure on Israel. But of course, that is such an incredibly low bar. I mean, we're talking about US pressure making the Israelis, instead of allowing 0 trucks to go in of aid into Gaza, maybe they let in 15. That was the kind of progress that the Biden administration was holding out, talking about how their pressure worked on Israel. But of course, as we've seen where we are now, with Gaza almost completely, entirely decimated, and the north of Gaza now cut off from the rest of Gaza. We have Gaza City and north cut off. People were told to leave, and everyone who remained in northern Gaza is seen as a combatant, and the Israelis are treating them as such. So not allowing food, and not allowing into northern Gaza, and not allowing anyone to come back. Now, the Biden administration, to your question, is this full circle? I mean, I don't really know what you mean by full circle exactly. I don't think the administration intended in any way either to be involved in a war in the Middle East, or to do the extent of damage that it has done in the Middle East. The way that the US has operated vis-a-vis Israel when it comes to this war has not only resulted in the complete decimation, extermination of Palestinians, the decimation of international law and norms and rules that people assumed that countries had to operate under. All the red lines that we saw being erased in Syria, with Russian bombing of hospitals and ambulances and schools, that was a red line that was eroded. It was just eroded by an adversary. And now we saw the red lines being eroded by an ally. And what implications that has for the future, I think we haven't even begun to see yet. The other sort of impact or effect that this had is that there has been, and people in the region will of course know this and can talk to this increasing rift between societies in the Middle East and their rulers. People in Egypt, people in Jordan, the anger that they're feeling, not just at Israel and the United States, but also towards their own rulers and their own leaders for not doing enough to to use their weight and their relationships with Israel to do anything about what's happening in Gaza. That also, I think, that impact of that tension and that anger between or towards people in the region against the rulers, that also is something that I think we haven't seen fully play out yet, and is something that is going to have negative ripple effects in the region that the next US president will have to deal with. Last couple of points. There was a letter that the Biden administration sent to Prime Minister Netanyahu and then Defense Minister Gallant, giving them 30 days to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We are now coming up to that 30-day deadline, and the consequences that were laid out in the letter were included potential freezing of arms or suspension of arms to Israel. That's going to be a big test in the next few days to see what the Biden administration actually does when 30 days have passed and the Israelis have not achieved any of those conditions that were laid out in the letter. And that really goes to my last point, which is there are 2 months left, 2.5 months left of the Biden administration. And when people ask what can happen between now and then, I think, I never like to make absolute predictions when it comes to this region, because I don't think anyone knows at any given time, what is going to happen. But I will say that I'm not optimistic that we are going to see any major changes happening in the next couple of months. The only thing to watch out for is in about 4 days when this 30-day deadline passes, to see if Biden actually pulls the plug and does something with regards to military assistance to Israel. But of course, anything that he does could potentially be undone by President Trump when he comes into office. So you have 2 months where you can have either nothing happen at all, or you can have some progress, and then we have to worry about whether that progress will be undone with the next administration. And we can talk about Trump moving, in the next couple of rounds. And I don't think it's completely clear cut what Trump will do on the Middle East. We can get into that. But I think for now, I would just like to say that I don't see a lot of optimism. I don't see a lot of change. And that unfortunately, I think the second and third order effects of what we've seen in the Middle East over the last year are going to continue to play out throughout the Trump administration. And he's going to deal with a lot of issues that were born out of the last year.
Thank you, Jasmine. Jasmine, I do want to ask you a very quick question before we move on to Iyad, because you spoke about uh, essentially Biden and the Biden administration being able to empathize, or essentially their response was empathizing with Israel given October 7th. But we haven't spoken so much about their empathy or their understanding of the Palestinian perspective. Can we speak a little bit towards that? Because of course there are lots of conversations, particularly by Palestinians, by Lebanese people, by Arabs, about the dehumanization or understanding now how they've been so thoroughly dehumanized by this administration. So can we speak to that a little bit?
No, absolutely. I mean, the fact is that there wasn't much empathy with Palestinians, Palestinian deaths. I mean, I could name several examples of the Biden administration not when you look at the words that they use when they talk about obviously what was a horrific incident, an attack on October 7th, and how they've talked about what happened afterwards. The first thing Secretary of State Tony Blinken said when he arrived in Israel after October 7th was, he said, "I am here as a Jewish person." And he is, and that's, of course, that's fine. And he's a human being. He has every right, and it is expected to empathize, with someone who is more familiar to you. But he's also the US Secretary of State. And when Biden says, I am a Zionist, when Secretary of State Blinken says, I am a Jewish person, I'm coming here. So, and then on the other hand, when you talk about Palestinians, one of the first things that President Biden did that was really shocking, I think, to a lot of people was focusing on the death toll and whether or not the numbers were correct or not. And that was after the numbers had already reached, they were in the tens of thousands. So that very kind of surgical, practical, like looking at numbers and looking at things, there was no emotion in the way that they spoke about Palestinians, about Palestinian children. There was a press conference, there were two press conferences. Someone shared this like side by side where John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, was talking about Ukrainian school children or children being killed. He had to stop the press conference because he was in tears. And then you have kind of side by side him talking about casualties in Gaza and saying something like, well, war is ugly. It's horrible, but war is ugly. You know, people are going to die. And so I think the dehumanization of Arabs, of Muslims, of people in the region has been probably one of the most difficult things for people to come to terms with and come to grips with. People talk about it not just from a policy perspective, but from a human perspective as well. You look at people you thought were friends and colleagues and allies and the way they've been reacting, whether it's in administrations or outside. And people are kind of you see this so much, people from the region or people working on the region to say, have you never cared about our lives? Or I mean, has it always been this way and we just didn't realize until now? So this Lebanese writer, I'm sure many of you have read this article because it was shared very widely, but this Lebanese writer, her name is Lina Munzer.
Mhm.
She wrote a searing, really just absolutely incredible commentary on what has been happening over the last year. And one of the lines she said that hit home with a lot of people from the region and of the region was that, the impact, one of the hardest things about the last year was realizing just the extent to which Arabs and Muslims have been dehumanized and how their lives don't matter as much. Now, I really think that that has done just untold damage in so many ways. And I think that in the next US administration, in the Trump administration, among the many things that he will have to deal with and that he will have to try to correct, if he is so inclined, is to start talking about and treating people in the region as if they have equal value in life to people outside the region.
Okay. I think we're gonna get back to this conversation, Jasmine. We end at a really good point. Before we speak about Trump, I want to move on to Iyad. Um, Iyad, how are you doing?
A little triggered by the conversation so far. It just reviewing a year of genocide is really, really hard. It's never been easy to be a Palestinian, but this year in particular has been beyond our imagination.
So yeah, let's speak from a Palestinian perspective, and obviously also as Iyad, as someone who's in policy circles, as a human rights defender. Um, where are we right now regarding the Israeli genocide in Gaza and overall Palestine policy in the US?
So I don't want to repeat things that Jasmine has already mentioned, and she gave an excellent overview of the U.S. Policy. Of course, the context in which we're speaking cannot be separated from the conversation. The context, of course, is Trump winning the election, and everybody's wondering what does Trump's next 4 years mean for the region. I want to start by pointing out something that I think is not covered enough, which is how the Abrahamic Accords led to October 7th. This is something that um, is included actually as a chapter in my next book. My next book is going to be about Palestine, about strategy. You see, for a very long time, the paradigm of the prospective peace between the state of Israel and the Arab region was based upon a paradigm called a land for peace. The idea was, Israel is occupying Palestinian land. In this case, of course, a certain concession has been made to the state of Israel that says that Palestinian land means the West Bank and Gaza, and not all of Palestinian lands as in historical Palestine. So the idea is that Israel will withdraw from these areas. It will give the land back, the West Bank and Gaza, and in return for that, Arab states are going to normalize relations with Israel, and there's going to be normal relations. Normalize, of course, meaning Israel will be just another Middle Eastern state. It'll be a normal Middle Eastern state with normal relations economic, diplomatic, political, military, etc. So that was the paradigm until the Abrahamic Accords. In fact, the Arab Peace Initiative, which was issued by the late King Abdullah, I believe, of Saudi Arabia. I think Abdullah Alaoudh, our colleague, can also talk a little bit about the Saudi perspective here. Again, kind of put this offer on the table, gave this offer to Israel, saying that should you withdraw from Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza, and should a Palestinian state get established, we are giving you this offer that we will normalize relations with you collectively. The Abrahamic Accords came at a period, it came at the tail end of a period. Of course, the period of in the region between 2014, 2015, kind of the dying days of the Obama presidency, and around 2017, 2018 was basically marked by counter-revolutions, a rise of counter-revolutionary forces. The biggest, like the center of gravity of this counter-revolutionary force was the oil-rich states, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Of course, in 2018 and 2019, we had another round of uprisings in the region. We had, for example, a change of government in Sudan. We had actually 2 uprisings in Sudan. We had a change of government in Algeria after large protests. We had a protest movement in Jordan. We had a massive protest movement in Iraq and in Lebanon. This, of course, was ended by the COVID pandemic, and it didn't really continue after that. So when the context for the Abrahamic Accords really was that there are certain Arab regimes that felt very anxious about their position because there was a perception that the United States is no longer long-term invested in the region from a geopolitical perspective. This is rooted in, like there are things that change from year to year very slowly, but if you look at it as decade to decade, you can see that there has been a kind of a policy. I'm not saying the United States is leaving the region, but there has been a policy, at least a long-term view of disengagement, of getting, I think Obama talked, for example, about leading from behind. And there was a policy of saying, this region used to be very important because of the oil, but then the US is now a next exporter of oil, especially after the shale revolution, basically changed the paradigm of the oil markets. And so these regimes were looking for, keep in mind also the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia were very excited about the Trump administration. Again, we could, if we could kind of again zoom out, we can see that one of the first things they did was the siege, the boycott of Qatar, and basically the attempted coup in the state of Qatar. And we remember basically at the time, basically what that did also to the Arab public sphere. That was when Kawaakibi's work on disinformation started. So for their own reasons, the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, of course, we know that the Abrahamic Accords basically was primarily primarily the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, with a promise about Sudan. Sudan itself was going through its own uprisings, and it was kind of in transition. So like, it's not sure how much of this represents the regime, whatever regime existed. But then it's been acknowledged among many analysts that Bahrain had lost strategic autonomy around the same time as the 2011 uprising, when basically it was the Saudi regime and the Gulf regimes that basically helped it stabilize itself after facing a massive uprising. So it was understood among policy circles, among analysts, that Bahrain's normalization was a stand-in. It was kind of a test balloon for Saudi normalization. Like, Bahrain wouldn't have taken this step if it was not blessed by Saudi Arabia. So essentially, the Abrahamic Accords broke the land for peace paradigm, because here we are with important Arab states. Keep in mind, the United Arab Emirates, even so, though it's a small country, it has the second or third, depending how you measure, second or third largest GDP in the Arab regions, the second or the third largest economy in the Arab region. So the fact that this happened gave us a completely new paradigm, because the end of the land for peace paradigm essentially means the end of any kind of pressure that the Arab side, here we're talking the Palestinian side, the Palestinian Authority side, any kind of pressure that they had whereby they could see Israel, you should respect us and you should negotiate with us, because if you do, you have this huge advantage, which is that this entire region is going to normalize with you. That paradigm was broken, and as a result, I think at the time I tweeted something like, the end of the Abrahamic Accords spell the end of the land for peace paradigm. The end of the land for peace paradigm is the end of basically the end of Palestinian statehood, the end of the prospect of Palestinian statehood. And the end of Palestinian statehood essentially also means the end of Israeli democracy. And this is kind of what happened. Yes,
I just
Razan.
want to clarify. So the land of peace paradigm essentially gave Palestinians agency, and the Abrahamic Accords took that away
I
from.
wouldn't say agency. It gave them a way to pressure Israel. It gave them kind of a card in the game, because it said basically, yes, maybe Israelis in general, the Israeli political majority, but also after October 7th, the popular majority do not want a Palestinian state. And for a very long time, the Israeli ruling elites have viewed any kind of Palestinian statehood between the river and the sea as a threat, as a serious, even existential national security threat to the state of Israel. Over here, you had kind of a pressure, a card that the Palestinians can play, saying that normalization is concomitant. It's basically conditional. Normalization of this region is conditional upon recognition and Palestinian statehood. That was taken away, and of course, this led us to a situation where events rolled very quickly after that. Because if you remember the Sheikh Jarrah protest, which was this huge internal uprising, happened on the heel of that. This was kind of the reflection of that. But then after that, you had, of course, October 7th happened in the same time as Jasmine was mentioning. There were these talks between MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. administration, basically about this deal of the century. Basically, this deal proposed initially by the Trump administration, Jared Kushner. The idea here was that, of course, I can tell you, the diplomatic side is what you can see as kind of a diplomatic and military alliance evolving in the Middle East, and it was attractive to the United States, not only because it checked the point of integrating Israel into the region, but also because of the idea of Israel potentially having some kind of alliance, like a military alliance with Arab countries to counter Iran. So basically, this allows the United States, again, to lead from behind instead of being actively engaged in countering Iran. You can have basically the region itself, certain U.S. allies in the region, work together towards that. And the way that we looked at it as Palestinians is basically that America, the U.S. administration, is giving the keys of the Middle East to Israel and saying, you manage this, we manage from behind. So this is the backdrop to that, and I think this is important context that should not be ignored. The Biden administration came in, like Jasmine said, with these promises about human rights, about making Mohammed bin Salman a pariah. This was again on the heels of the Khashoggi assassination. Of course, Jamal Khashoggi was a friend of ours and a friend of Abdullah Alaoudh as well. So there was this. On the one hand, there was this question: what is this relation? What does the U.S. really want from the region? But it's obvious that there was no long-term view here. There's no critical thinking, long-term view that says this is actually terrible for the region, and endorsing Trump's plan, Trump's vision for the region is actually bad, and it upends, in fact, U.S. foreign policy towards the region for before that point. I would add that. I'm curious to, of course, hear Abdullah's take about the Saudi part of this. But part of our work at Kawaakibi is disinformation analysis. And what we do really in disinformation analysis is kind of unique, because what we do is that we marry disinformation analysis with geopolitical analysis. So we try to get into the head of the producer of disinformation. In other words, we're not merely doing disinformation analysis in order to detect a trend here or there, but we're trying to understand whoever produced this disinformation campaign, what are they after? What are they looking at? Like, what does this tell us about their strategy, their outlook, etc.? And we can tell you from our work, which, you know, a lot of our reports basically were proprietary; they were not really released to the public. MBS is really good at a certain kind of negotiation, and I think maybe Abdullah can also comment on this. He's good at stringing along the Americans. He's good at pretending to the Americans or presenting to the Americans that he's willing to go further than he's actually capable of or willing to go. And the Americans get excited about that, and they would say, yeah, I mean, this is really looking good, this is happening, etc. And he would never actually go that far. He would always have a reason to increase his demands, and that way he can keep, you know, if he says no immediately, he has lost leverage. So he keeps saying yes to more and more and more things, even though, you know, he has no plans and no plans of actually delivering on that. Going back to the disinformation side, and I'll stop talking in a bit because I think I've been talking for a while, and thank you, Razan, for helping me keep time. We keep talking about 43 or 44,000 dead. I think this is an outdated number. The Lancet, a medical journal, back in July, did a study where it tried to estimate not only the direct deaths, basically the people who were killed directly by bullets or bombs or demolitions, but the indirect deaths. Because in the case of this kind of societal destruction, communal destruction, genocide, you're not only looking at who was killed because a bomb went off, but also who died by starvation, who died by disease, who died by other preventable means. The number they came up with in July is 183,000. By project, like if we just extend that, we're talking about over 200,000 dead so far. Keep in mind that the Gaza before the genocide had a population of between 2.2 and 2.3 million. So this is basically quite a staggering percentage of the population. And we know, I mean, Jasmine mentioned John Kirby having to stop because he was choking up and tearing up about the death of Ukrainian children. The credible reports today we have is that up to 70% of the dead in Gaza are women and children. Half the population of Gaza are actually children anyway. So you can estimate that around half of those dead are children. The total dead in Ukraine, according to what I Googled just before, is 545. Terrible, of course, but you know, scale-wise, it's not even comparable. I'll end on this note because we're talking about Trump and what Trump will do. Trump actually, right after Trump's election, Netanyahu appointed a man by the name of Yechiel Leiter as Israel ambassadors to the United States. This man is an ex-Kahanist. He used to be a member of the Jewish Defense League, which is basically an organization that used to be considered a terrorist organization by the United States. He has a son who died in Gaza during the current events. And he is a proponent of complete Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. In other words, annexation of the West Bank. In my view, the two-state solution is not going to survive Trump's second presidency. By the end of the second presidency, there will be no talk about a two-state solution. Apartheid is going to be formal. It's not just something that human rights organizations say, but legally speaking, you know, it's the fact on the ground. And you know, we have to also wonder what's going to happen to the region itself, because also right after Trump's election, Netanyahu pulled out of ceasefire talks in Lebanon. Anyway, I'll stop here, Razan, and I know that there's a lot to pick on, but we also have to ask about the ICC itself, because Trump has I mean, the United States generally, but Trump himself has a particular animus towards the ICC.
Okay, let's get to that in the second round. I want to actually bring in Abdullah, and then bring in Karim. But Abdullah, given that Iyad has spoken about the context of the Abrahamic Accords and of the land of peace paradigm, and obviously, since you're going to be speaking to us anyway about the context of human rights in the Gulf and particularly Saudi Arabia. So can I bring you in for you to comment on this?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Kawaakibi for hosting this event. Yeah, so I'll try to be brief on this first part of Trump's role in Saudi Arabia. And it was the other day listening to a podcast that Jared Kushner did, and he spoke about the relationship, the special relationship with MBS. And one of the things that caught my attention, things that are like not what I think was not revealed publicly before this, that the relationship that started with one economist from Saudi Arabia, who like his name is Fahd Tunisi, who introduced him to MBS, and then the relationship was the three conditions that Jared Kushner gave to MBS when he was deputy crown prince for him to be accepted by the Trump administration were based on three things, none of which were related to democratic values or anything. But the first was accepting Israel and recognizing Israel, and basically the what we know now as the Abrahamic Accords. And MBS responded positively, saying he will be happy to do that as long as he's accepted as crown prince. And I think that's one of the conditions that actually brought MBS to the prominence in politics. He was, of course, deputy crown prince and the favorite son of the king, but he became crown prince based on things mainly including this one, which is accepting the idea of Abrahamic Accords. So this dated long before even MBS became crown prince and before even the inauguration of the Trump administration. Once MBS, I mean, a few days even before MBS was inaugurated, before MBS became crown prince, he waged this campaign against Qatar, blockaded it, and of course started this campaign like 1 month and a half after that. He started his first crackdown with the not just the green light, but blessing of Trump. I mean, MBS started the crackdown in Saudi Arabia with the blessing of Trump administration that started actually with arresting my own father in September 2017. And then the second crackdown was against judges around like October 2017. November 2017 was the famous Ritz-Carlton anti-corruption purge that also had the blessing of Trump, who tweeted at that time that these business tycoons were milking Saudi Arabia and it's time to fight corruption in Saudi Arabia. So he gave the green light for which ended up for a campaign and a crackdown that ended up not just torturing but also killing some people close to the former former governor of Riyadh at the time. And then it goes on and on and on for all the campaigns that had the blessing. So I think this kind of summarized and give the impression, that can give the impression of what Trump is like when it relates to human rights in Saudi Arabia. He was behind all of these things. And then we remember exactly what Iyad mentioned about the murder of Khashoggi, when basically Trump told Bob Woodward he saved his he saved his ass, basically. There is no way to rephrase this. And then Jared Kushner, after the Khashoggi murder, was coaching MBS in weathering the storm. So they basically were directly involved with the human rights violations in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf, and how MBS acted aggressively toward neighboring countries, including Qatar and the Yemen war, and the November purge that actually ended up putting Prime Minister of Lebanon under house arrest at that time. And then that aggressive also approach toward Canada that started the rift with Canada over a tweet in which Canada tweeted about Samar Badawi, woman human rights defender who was arrested over her activism for human rights. So you get that like approach from Saudi Arabia and MBS, and how Trump not just enabled and emboldened, but actually, I would say, masterminded the very coming to power, MBS coming to power in the first place and becoming a crown prince, and then all these human rights violations and atrocities committed by Saudi Arabia with the back end blessing and enabling of the Trump administration. So that's on one hand, and with the other, what MBS realized is that instead of going the old approach of given like everything that the US wanted, he can basically take everything he wanted from the US without giving anything tangible in return, other than like very purely transactional deals. Because Trump was and is like hugely transactional. So we remember how the transactions, the arm deals, and all these things during the Trump administration. I don't want to go to other points, but like quickly, what we can imagine what the Trump administration is going to say and do in this term, I would say, is a Trump administration that now is not fearing second election. A Trump administration that is not restricted by, for example, a Democratic majority in Congress. So I think it's going to be even worse, and we should prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
But we can talk more about this.
Yeah, I want to rein this in because we have about 2 minutes before we have to move on to Kareem. Can you give us an overview of how it's been since Biden took over? Has there been much of a change, or has Biden generally continued what Trump started?
I would say that what Biden did is basically promised that MBS will be a pariah, but treated him more or less close to what Trump had. He just continued the same path with small exceptions here and there, and this despite what the Biden admin and his team thinks they did. Of course, and we have to be fair also. For example, the Khashoggi ban that they are very proud of, and they think that it's a huge deal. It was like actually a Trump admin idea that was done even before then. But what the Biden did is just made it public and added some other names. Two, they released the ODNI report that was not public before then. And then they stopped for a while what they called a defensive weapon, which meant nothing, to be honest, because they continued the arms sales with what they called defensive weapons, and they stopped the offensive weapon arms sales, and they just basically circumvented this. I mean, they called whatever they wanted to sell as defensive weapon, and then they did, so it didn't matter as much. I think the turning point in the Biden administration was when the Biden administration, when MBS feared a lot Biden's Biden administration's wrath, and he released some political prisoners, Lujan al-Hidrul and some other Americans. He toned down the Yemen war, stopped the blockade, like basically ended suddenly the blockade of Qatar. So for the admin, instead of using all that and started to pressure, they just basically decided to continue the path of Trump. And this is when MBS realized that he can outsmart them, and he can pressure back, and he can, and they are not serious about him paying consequences for everything he did. So that was like even emboldening him even more to go even worse in executions and increased sentences of human rights offenders. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. In the second fold, we'll have a conversation on moving forward, how we react to this as human rights defenders. But I want to move on to Kareem, our final speaker. So, Kareem, given everything that's been said, I want to get your take as a Lebanese citizen on the US policy in Lebanon, how it's been projected, how it's perceived, how it's received by Lebanese residents, and what's missing from the conversation so far.
First of all, thank you a lot for this conversation. It's been very interesting to hear the insights from all the speakers. There's a lot in terms of, general analysis that seems to compound all together. And it's good that we're kind of building a comprehensive narrative from below and from our general humanist perspective that is often sidelined in the conversation. Now, if we look at Lebanon in particular, the Lebanese people have been cynical for a long time. So it's not just since October 2023. They've been cynical vis-a-vis their own ruling class. They've been cynical towards Hezbollah itself. They've been really disillusioned with all of the promises for peace, prosperity, or otherwise. And it's also a very polarized society today. On one hand, those that are with Hezbollah and take its word for granted, and on the other hand, those that wouldn't even mind seeing Israel destroy Hezbollah. So a very, very polarized sentiment. So we have to account for that when we're looking at how the Lebanese can perceive external actors, because they're also divided on that level. But generally speaking, obviously, a very big portion of the Lebanese people see the United States as an obstacle for Lebanese development and prosperity, see the United States as a funder for the constant bombs being thrown on Lebanon today, and are not only bombs, but are the source of the almost erasure of the border towns of South Lebanon. And also a far wider community erasure for what is called the community around Hezbollah, or the Shia community more generally, whether it's opponents or with. And we can see this manifesting on a day-to-day basis and developing and advancing, as both Biden and Trump seem to have been competing for a while about who is more protective of Israel's interests. And I think the election cycle has not been useful in that regard, even if the people who have been protesting a genocide for 1 year have tried to leverage in the other direction. But we also see other lobbyists. We also see people who are very supportive of Israel's military campaign. An account for this is that while Netanyahu was not popular in Gaza because he started with an intelligence failure and also had a very contentious relationship with the hostage families, a lot of people in Israel support his offensive in Lebanon because they consider that an independent front, a front launched by Hezbollah. And the idea of returning the residents to the north is taken up as a responsibility, and particularly when he was able to score a number of victories. What does that mean? It means that there is a lot of leverage on the Israeli side when it comes to Lebanon. And that means that the Americans are choosing to divorce themselves from that. And it seems that Lebanon is this representation of the geopoliticization of the war. It is no longer Israel committing a genocide in Gaza. It is now a regional war in which Iran is involved, Hezbollah is involved, the Houthis are involved. So it looks more complicated, more complex. And that's why we don't see even many human rights organizations talking about the Israeli assault on Lebanon, right? At least not as much. And even if obviously it pales in comparison to the genocide happening in Gaza, there is immense devastation and there is a need to find security for the Lebanese people amid all these developments. Now, I also talk from the perspective of someone who's in the United States right now, someone who has been involved in anti-war protests since October 2023, whether on the Palestine side or the Lebanese side. There obviously needs to be some lessons learned from the side of the people who have been protesting for a year, right? There has to be something we have learned, not only with regards to how we look at the US administration and the incentives of different social groups, different lobby groups. There's also a lot to learn about what we can do, about what we should have done, about some of the mistakes we committed, about some things that we have to advance, right? Because I think within this sphere of influence, within the audience we have right here, there is almost a consensus that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, whether in terms of the neocon side of advancing wars and support for dictators in the name of stability, or whether it's on the side of total support for Israel, or whether it's on the side um, of kind of going in the direction of ignoring the aspirations of people in the region, right? That's particularly important. There becomes another side about what we have to do, and I speak as an Arab person, right? What we have to do as people who should have an influence in the Arab world, should also influence the intellectual trajectory of the Arab world. How should we actually locate our own rereading of our role in the region? How do we create some kind of cultural conversation between us and the mainstream Jewish community? Right? In fact, this is a genocide taking place that is part of a wider conflict with ethnic undertones, and we don't have a constructive, historical, futuristic conversation between Jewish and Arab intellectuals. That doesn't exist. You don't see it. And I'm talking about the mainstream, right? I'm not talking about an Israeli leftist, communist, anarchist radical that intersects with some of the mainstream in the Arab world, or the neocon Arab in Washington who intersects with the Israeli right. I'm talking about mainstream intellectuals on both sides who talk about the responsibility of communities towards one another to create a humanistic, secular alternative in the region.
And
That is not
also within Arab communities themselves.
within, of course, obviously. And if that doesn't happen, if there isn't an Arab Jewish alternative, that's a big thing to say in the Arab world nowadays, an Arab Jewish alternative that calls for a democratic, humanistic perspective of mutual acknowledgement, while obviously acknowledging the Israeli asymmetry, while obviously acknowledging the genocide and the way Israel is transformed to a settler colonial apartheid project. If that doesn't exist, then we won't succeed. If the alternative to Zionist colonialism is going to be political Islam or monarchy normalization or the Arab nationalist language and discourse that we've gotten used to for the past 7 to 8 decades, we won't make progress. If we don't find something completely different, innovative, mainstream, popular, goes from below, I think we're going to face a lot of problems in the future.
Mhm. Thank you, Karim. So we are running a bit late on time. Just a quick, sorry, give me 1 second. We may be going ahead. We may be going overhead for about 20 minutes extra, because we have one final question and actually a conversation that I want to open up to all of the floor, which stems actually from Karim's final point, and it's, should we be changing tactics? What are our tactics like? I think, respectively speaking, we have an analyst, we have human rights defenders, we have community organizers on this panel and in attendance. I think a lot of us have been engaged in advocacy towards the US government, or have been engaged in policy recommendations for our respective causes, whether it's the Gulf, Palestine, Lebanon, MENA in general, Syria. How do we move forward? And I think I want to open up this conversation. The question is big, but we need a starting point. So if I can start with Iyad, we do have 20 minutes. So if you can respond within a few minutes, and then we'll move on to Jasmine, Abdullah, and back to Karim.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I actually just came back from a convening that happened in Barcelona with it's basically Euro-Mediterranean kind of civil society. So basically, it was really the first chance for a lot of people to meet since October 7th, basically at a civil society level. But it was also well attended by officials in very highly ranked in the European Union's structure. And there was, of course, there were many Palestinians, many Arabs, but there were also some Israelis. The kind of Israelis that even come to these events tend to be Israelis who have already resolved their issue with ethnic nationalism, aka Zionism. And it's of course, I'm not saying that there aren't some who still identify as liberal Zionists, but there is an understanding that, just like Karim said, ethnic nationalist solutions for the region simply will fail. I'm not talking, again, and just like Karim hinted, it's not just about Jewish ethnic nationalism, but it's also about ethnic nationalism, or some kind of definition of closed nationalism on the other side. I'll also remind that Islamism, at least as the way I understand it, defined it, is basically a kind of ethnic nationalism, but for Muslims. It's basically the idea of creating, it's creating a nation state, a closed nation state for Muslims. So I'm just want to tell you the conclusion at the end of this. The conclusion generally was that there was a kind of a model for doing activism or doing advocacy, etc. That kind of I don't think it ever existed, but a lot of people kind of thought that this is how the world worked, which is that human rights activists, civil society activists, advocates such as ourselves and our community, their job is to document human rights abuses, to basically expose human rights abuses, and there is some kind of international mechanism, some kind of mechanism at the national or international level that can once these reports and these kind of are presented to them, they would rectify it, take corrective action, etc. As a Palestinian, I can tell you that this never existed, but it seemed to exist. It seemed to work for some people sometimes, and it only really, like, the hint here is that it only worked where it intersected with the geopolitical imperatives of major powers. So basically, it was never really about an international liberal order, but really it was really clothing language, different ways of saying national interest. There is a shift here because a lot of advocates, civil society activists, human rights activists, freedom fighters are understanding that we need to shift to a policy of power building. Once we shift to, like, basically this kind of grassroots movement building from below with a progressive vision, the moment you do that, number one, we have to understand what power means and how power has evolved in the 21st century. The meaning of power has changed from the mid 20th century to approaching now the first, we're already approaching the quarter of the 21st century. The meaning of power has changed, and we have to understand it. We have to understand how it changed. We have to understand the relationship between movement building and power, narratives and power, winning the story, basically. But then the idea here is power building here is, as a strategy, it doesn't have to depend upon our vision for what happens in the world. So basically, there is a kind of power building a kind of strategy that depends upon correctly predicting what's going to happen tomorrow. But when you have power, when you basically pursue a strategy of power building, it doesn't matter really whether things in the future are going to go this way or that. If you have more power, whatever happens in the future, you can use it properly to, for your advantage. So this is what I see the biggest change here in paradigm, a change from activism based upon some kind of like appealing to powerful others to act on your behalf, to power building. And this means, of course, long-term vision. It means that we acknowledge that this is not going to be fixed in a year or two, in an administration or two. It also acknowledges that we, as civil society activists, as human rights activists, as people who are in this fight for the long haul, in certain ways, our careers are longer than any kind of political administration.
Iyad, can we just very briefly speak about practically what we're saying? Like, practically, what does
so this is why I have to write a book about it, because practically speaking, again, it means that instead of us appealing to others to act on our behalf, we are, we're basically building power for the long term and building strategy for the long term. But it also means that we have to understand the region as an organism. We have to basically think beyond borders, because we can't really be thinking country by country here, because again, once you think at that level, you have to think long term, but also regionally and even internationally. Maybe I'll stop here because I know that others want to also give their perspective. But Yeah, I mean, I think part of Kawaakibi's strategy, this is something that Kawaakibi did actually in 2022, is that it convened around 70 human rights defenders and activists from across the Middle East and North Africa for a closed retreat, where we just discussed strategy and like discussed how we can not replicate each other's work and how we can basically be on the same page. And I think this is something that I would like to see Kawaakibi doing going forward.
Thank you, Iyad. Jasmine, I want to bring you into this, particularly since you come from the world of policy. What's your take on this, on the future of organizing, of power? Should we be changing tactics? How?
I mean, it's obviously this is like the important question right now is, how you move forward and how you try to achieve as many gains as possible on the issues that you work about. So that you work on. I mean, I always approach this. I mean, I worked 8 years in government and I worked on, basically it was the Arab Spring, it was the war against ISIS, it was all of these, things that, issues where there was a lot of advocacy aimed at the US government to try to shift its policies, whether it was in Syria or Egypt or, Bahrain, the Gulf, all of these issues. So what I'm about to say, I think sometimes when I'm having these conversations, depending on who I'm having it, whether it's journalists or activists or analysts, sometimes I think sometimes I think people get upset when I talk about being realistic, but that's only because I think they presume that realistic just means accepting the status quo. It's not. There's a difference between accepting the status quo and being realistic about how to achieve what you want to achieve given the realities that we live in, and working with those realities to push them forward, as opposed to just making yourself entirely irrelevant to the conversation, right? And so this is why it's a nuanced conversation, and but it's an important one, because I think that when you're advocating for the things that we're talking about, human rights, social justice, shifting policies, whether it's the US, the UK, other countries towards the Middle East. Let's just say, for example, now you're going to want to influence the Trump administration's policies in the Middle East. There are there are 3 different audiences to influence. And I don't necessarily think that the same people or organizations are best fit or best placed to influence all 3 of those audiences. But I think the key is working together to holistically, collectively influence those 3 audiences. And the 3 audiences I'm talking about are people, so public opinion. Government is a second, completely different audience, and the way you talk to them is different. The way you approach them with ideas is different from the way you try to influence people, neighbors, communities. And then, of course, the third is media. I might be missing some or one, you guys can jump in, but I mean, those are the 3 really important ones. And, I guess I would say like other organizations, other civil society organizations, but I would focus on media, people / communities, and government. And I think that if we look at, public awareness and how to influence public awareness, that is about connecting with people. That is about having conversations, joining as many conversations as you can in your community. That means, when you're marching and you're protesting, you are open to talking to people, asking you, well, what do you mean? What are you doing? What is this about? The majority of publics in the UK, I talk about the UK because I live in London now, and I'm just kind of flying constantly to a lot of places. But so, whether it's in London or the US, the majority of people in those countries actually oppose the war in Gaza, oppose what's happening in Gaza, oppose unconditional support to Israel. That, I think, is not just coming from their own opinions, but it's also coming from them talking to people and understanding you know, why this is wrong and having their minds changed. And so that advocacy and that engagement with people, societies, neighbors, friends, all of that stuff is really important. I think when you're talking to government, I'll say a couple of things about Trump in particular. So if we step back and look at successive US administration policies towards the Middle East, basically George W. Bush was the last US president that was a regime change, you know, president, or a president that thought you could go in and change things in the Middle East. Every other president after that, whether it's Democrat or Republican, the lesson that they learned from Iraq and Afghanistan was no way, never again, we're not getting involved, like, you know, get US troops out. And so advocates and civil society and analysts, and you have to also, like, we have to meet them there. You know, there is this stance that, or this belief that the region, whatever significant change occurs in the region internally, is going to have to come from the region. And so you won't have a lot of you know, if you're talking about, so sorry, I guess I would say I would focus on, when I'm having conversations with people in government, I would focus on realistic, achievable policy recommendations that take into account the domestic political considerations of whatever government is in place in that country. Mirroring that language, speaking that language, understanding what the boundaries are, and then saying, here's the support that you can provide in these boundaries. For example, Trump. If we look at the US ambassador to the UN that's just been nominated, we can 100% predict that Israel will continue to be protected by the US at the UN Security Council. The person who was nominated to be ambassador, she led the sort of inquiries into the campus protests that resulted in several university presidents being fired, you know, extremely pro-Israel. So, okay, so now we know what the UN is going to look like. You also, though, on the other hand, have an Arab American and Muslim American community that helped deliver Michigan to Donald Trump, that is more engaged with him, and we know that he likes to be engaged and he likes to be, you know, involved and supported. You know, Trump also now has an Arab American son-in-law, and that son-in-law's father is predicted to be involved in US policy and diplomacy in the Middle East. And so there are things that those two factors weren't there in a first Trump term. And I think that will make a difference in some way. And then, of course, you have the media perspective and how you talk to the media about what needs to happen in the Middle East, who needs support, why they need support, why this is good for the security and stability of the Middle East, kind of always bringing it back to, this is not just good for the people of the Middle East, this is why this is good for everyone. Like when I talk to policymakers in the UK, I mentioned the ripple effects that the war in Gaza and now in Lebanon are having on the streets of the UK. The Labour Party lost votes and lost members, parliamentarians and you know, figures that were voted out by their constituencies because of the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. You could argue the same thing here in the US. So just going back to what you were saying, Razan, about intersectionality, it's not just within the region, it's also when you're making these you know, when you're engaging, whether it's with the media, people, or government, but particularly media and government, it's really making that case that the security and stability of the Middle East is integral to the security and stability worldwide of the world, whether when we talk about foreign policy or the impact on domestic issues within countries, and that if people want to keep their own countries stable, that if governments care about their own social cohesion outside the Middle East, then they should be paying attention to issues of human rights and social justice inside the Middle East as well.
Thank you, Jasmine. So we're speaking about building essentially holistic and cohesive movements. I think the question that comes after this, and maybe we can take a jab at this, should we have time, not that we have much time, is how do we start with these movements? Who spearheads it? I think what we have right now is we have sort of a discrepancy between those in civil society and those in policy, particularly when it comes to the Palestine, Syria, or Lebanon sphere, even Yemen, arguably. You have people from these contexts that aren't speaking to each other because they see each other as enemies. Because, for example, those in policy are speaking the language of policymakers, those in civil society are speaking the language of organizers, those in media are speaking the language of media. How do we get to this? Um, how do we get to a place where we understand that we're all part of the same movement, but we are targeting different audiences? And I do want to open this up also to Iyad, Abdullah, and Kareem. So if any of you have an answer, please do come in. But Jasmine, if you have an answer also, please go ahead.
Well, I think very quickly to give the guys, a chance to come in, I think it starts with just that. I mean, we as people who ultimately care about the same issues, which is peace, justice, security, all of these issues, there is way too much animosity between these groups. Like, I will sometimes get criticized for attending certain conferences or going to speaking on certain media channels. Or the thing is, I'm like, but that's my job, right? My job is to talk to those people. Your job is to be out in the streets. Your job is to be behind the scenes here, but we're all actually working on the same issues. So I think just number one is realizing that not everyone is going to be an activist. You need the activists, you need the journalists, you need the analysts, you need the policymakers, you need the people inside government. You also hear people getting criticized. Well, why didn't you resign? Maybe there are things that they're trying to do. I mean, of course, people will, sometimes it's like, oh no, there's nothing I can do. I need to wash my hands away from this. I'm going to leave government. I'm, friends are now in contact with a lot of the people who resigned from US government and other European governments over Gaza. But I also know people who are still on the inside, who are trying to do whatever they can. And that should be an accepted, like, the foundation should be everyone get in and do what you can, given your qualifications and your location and what your relative advantage or what your comparative skill and advantage is. And it's all hands on deck, right? It's all hands on deck. That should be the basic agreement.
Thank you, Jasmine. Kareem, I want to come to you quickly, given that you're a community organizer, if you have any comments on either the question or what's already been said.
First of all, is my microphone better?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So first of all, I agree a lot with what Jasmine said about the vision of roles, about the need to be realistic, about the need to pick battles. That's very important, not to be just maximalist for the sake of it, but also not simply conceding on all our ideological commitments. Having a roadmap, having a theoretical ceiling, and having a spirit that's related to that theoretical ceiling in order to mobilize a strong populace of writers, journalists, intellectuals who believe in what we say. And we should be clear about it, right? We shouldn't shy away from being clear. We should be unapologetic and say, this is what we want. And at the same time, we know this is what we can achieve. So we'll be focusing on that battle. And I think this is something that, all movements have committed to. I also think, and this is something that I'm being self-critical of, but also something that we can all think about, maybe potentially finding a way, a transition from the human rights to the political project. And this is so difficult in an Arab region in which you cannot have political parties and associations that can build power and grassroots. And therefore, in many cases, we are forced to replace that with human rights projects. But finding that transition is not a detail. Finding a way to make this a transnational social movement that is not the traditional left-wing Marxist-Leninist types in the Arab world, but also retains some loyalty to progressive principles of social justice, secular humanist perspectives, finding that balance and engaging with that and building on that and creating a school of thought that resonates with the Arab world and a cultural resonance that builds on the Nahda and builds on the Arab Spring and builds on the 2019 uprisings. That's a challenge, and I think we need to find a way to pursue that transition.
Thank you, Kareem, and hopefully at Kawaakibi we will begin looking into this question, or into the answers for this question. Abdullah, I'll move on to you. If you have any final thoughts on this.
Yeah, very quickly. So I think I don't want to repeat any thing that everybody said here. It's a great strategies and tips. So just additional point is that in addition to the people, grassroots, all these strategies I mentioned, I think and taking a lesson from the first Trump term, the mainstream media was a lot on our side because, you know, they were critical of Trump. So when you were critical of Trump's allies, you get a lot of chance. So also taking advantage of that. Also, the Democrats who during the Biden administrations were restrained because they did not want to embarrass Biden. It's not Biden anymore. So we get that chance also of trying to rally some Democrats who are more toward our side. So that's also another option and another strategy. Third strategy is that Jasmine mentioned, which is also within the Trump either team or side, the Republican side generally. Yes, Trump being transactional and like these dictators and autocrats and Netanyahu and all that, trying to use that leverage to our side as much as we can, although it's little, but it's still like better than nothing. I think using all these techniques together may lead to something positive.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Iyad, do you have any final remarks before we conclude?
I think I just want to, I mean, of course, we could continue this conversation forever because it is a very stimulating, very important conversation. But I think I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. I mean, Razan, of course, and Amara, you've done a great job organizing this. I really loved, you know, the interventions from Kareem and Jasmine and Abdullah. And I feel like I just want to make a comment really about what Kareem mentioned about basically this kind of project, which is kind of a transnational. I mean the key words here for this project is you know, movement building, grassroots, progressive vision, long term power building, regional, international, intersectional, narrative based, etc. This basically connecting this not only to this an internationalist, basically humanist vision, but also to our identity, our history, like you said, the Arab Spring, but even before that, the Nahda. I think this is really the reason why we call this organization the Kawaakibi Foundation. I mean, Kawaakibi, of course, was this Syrian Arab intellectual who wrote brilliant works on authoritarianism. At the time, of course, he was talking about Ottoman authoritarianism. That it was that long ago. But he also represented a generation of where there was actually an alliance between the political forces of the region who are, you know, came from an Islamic perspective and those who were secular. This was represented, of course, in the 1920 constitution or attempted constitutional convention in Damascus at the time. We have lost that, and I'm just reminded by something that actually none other than Jamal Khashoggi mentioned to me in a dinner I had with him in the summer of 2018. He said the future of this region belongs to whoever can put people of an Islamist background and people of a secular background in the same political project. And that continues to be the struggle.
Thank you, Iyad, for those concluding remarks. And yes, thank you to everyone, to Abdullah, Iyad, Jasmine, Kareem, and to all of you for attending. We're so sorry we couldn't get around to the questions. We're hoping that in future events, and we will be having future events more frequently, we will have more time for questions and answers. So thank you, everyone, and good evening or good night, depending on where you are.